January, where President Lincoln, 1865, signed a piece of paper called the Emancipation Proclamation. It took nearly 6.5 months for our nation to hear all about it. The Emancipation Proclamation freed the Southern slaves after the War of Northern Aggression. Y'all know that war? Now, interesting question posed there. Why were just the Southern slaves freed? But we think of slavery a very certain way in our society, don't we? The way that we as a nation had slaves in the 1800s was cruel. It was not a humane way, nor was it a way that people ought to have been treated. Because of that idea of slavery moved away. Interestingly, just a side note for you, did you know there are more slaves in the world today than there ever has been? That is a horse. So, excuse me, I'm going to slide over here where my ADHD doesn't get me. Sorry. We're going to start in Exodus chapter 21. That's a horse, isn't it? That's what I'm telling you. Look, we don't see that every day in Hot Springs. You got me. Yeah, that's true. We are at the Redemption Ranch. What's wrong with you, Hayes? Exodus chapter 21. Slavery was not always the way it seemed to be in the United States. Beginning in verse number 1. Now these are the judgments which thou shalt set before them. If thou buy a Hebrew servant, 6 years shall he serve, and the 7th year he'll go out free for nothing. If he came in by himself, he'll go out by himself. If he's married, then his wife will go out with him. If his master hath given him a wife, and she born him sons and daughters, the wife and the children are still the master's, and he can go out by himself. If the servant plainly says, verse 5, I love my master and my wife and my children, I will not go out free, then his master will bring. You go back in your mind and ask yourself this question and try to answer it. How many of the slaves that were owned in the South during the 1800s you suppose would have said, well, I just love it here? Probably not a lot. There's a different type of relationship here. This is a relationship between two kinsmen, a Hebrew owning a Hebrew, and he can only go 6 years. He can't go more than that. God said he has to leave after that amount of time. He has to be able to pay that debt off. So when you and I look in Matthew chapter 18, and we look at that parable that's taught there, we see a parable about a couple of slaves. Somebody first, tell me what the parable was we studied on Sunday night. The parable of the talents. Remember the question we went home with that night? Are you 5? Are you 2? Or are you 1? What did we study last night? Soils. Okay. Are you the road? Are you a rocky soil? Are you a thorny soil or are you good soil? They're all asking the same question. Tonight's question that you're going to leave with is this. Are you a merciful servant? And here's what's happening in Matthew chapter 18. And for us to get some context with it, it's going to start in 21, and we only need to go with about 5 words. Then Peter came to him, stop. Is he the only one there? No. Once you look back at verse number 1, the disciples are there too. What it seems like, if I understand this correctly, and I could have this wrong. So, here's what it looks like to me. It looks like they're having a discussion. And that discussion sort of runs its course. And when it's over, Peter goes to Jesus and asks another question. The disciples are still there. But now we've gotten a little more private. And when Peter asks this question, Jesus turns and faces the rest of the group and begins to speak to them. Because I think because Peter's only asking what they're thinking. Peter's the guy who is just dumb enough or just brave enough, I'm not sure which, and maybe it changes on occasions, to do or to say something that everybody wished they would have said. Notice Peter for a moment. Lord, if that's you, let me get out of this boat. Peter said, come on. Or Jesus said, come on. And he got out. Peter's either just dumb enough or just brave enough to ask the question to get out of the boat. You know, all the other 11 had the opportunity to leave, but yet they all find themselves stuck behind the railing of that boat, scared. And here we find him, and he says, the Bible says, Matthew records, then Peter came to him and asked, Lord, how often will I forgive my brother sin against me? Until 7 times? Stop. From about verse 15 through about verse 20, Jesus has already given the directive for the church and for his disciples, even at this point, of how they should handle problems. Here it is. Look at verse 15. If your brother sins against you, go and show him your fault. All right, I don't like Tyler. That's not news. Yeah. So apparently Tyler has done something to me. And according to Matthew 18:15, he's not fully aware that he's done something to me. So my obligation given by Jesus is that I go to him and say, here's where the rub is. And then we talk about that alone. If we can't settle that, then we bring a couple of witnesses who would be able to establish the he said stuff. And if that doesn't work, then we're supposed to tell the church, and they should pray. And if that doesn't work, what can you do? If Tyler's just being a hardhead, he won't forgive me, what can you do? Where from Matthew, look at Matthew chapter 18, 15 through 20. Where in that particular section of Scripture does Jesus tell the amount of times that's supposed to happen? Look, it's in there. No. 15 to 20. Verses 15 through 20. How many times does Jesus say you're supposed to do that? Let's see. There's me going to Tyler. That's 1. Me taking 2 or 3 witnesses with me. That's 2. Me telling church. That's 3. So 3, right? So when Peter comes and says, should I forgive my brother up until 7 times? He has doubled what he thought was commanded and added 1. Because Peter's way better than Jesus, right? No, what he's thinking is, if Jesus says 3, and I show more compassion and I go further down the road than 3, well then that should really satisfy God's will. Look back at 15 to 20. Look real hard. Concentrate on this. If you are married, ish. How many of you have a spouse who does something that just irritates you? Oh, Mississippi was the first one. Miss Brandy does not. She does not have a spouse that ever irritates her. You know what she does when I irritate her? You know what she does? You're irritating me. Stop it. Okay. Now I know. See, before then I didn't know. I was just jagging around, and that's not a great thing. And here she says, this irritates me, stop it, and so it stops. Am I mad at her? No. Am I confused? Sometimes. Am I mad? No. I stop because it's irritating to her. The problem we have in 15 through 20 is somebody has a problem, but both sides don't know about it. Both sides are going to have to know about it in order for it to stop. And so Peter in verse 21 comes to him and says, Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Till 7 times? It's a good question. Jesus said, I do not say to 7 times, but to 70 times 7. And so everyone ought to be having some sort of diary with tick marks in it for each person so that they can count up to 490. And then when 491 comes, you don't have to do anything. It's an exaggeration. The number is an exaggeration for the idea of every time. Are you really going to keep up with 490 times? What if you miscount? You know, in the Jewish society, if you're giving a prisoner stripes and you miscount and you go past 40, it's fixing to be a bad day for you. What if I miscount and I forgive him one more time than I'm supposed to? Well, the fact of the matter is this. Jesus is making a statement of exaggeration to say, you forgive him whenever he comes. Why? Because he's your brother, because your family, because that's what you're supposed to do. And so he tells them this story. And he says, for this reason, what reason? For what reason? What's the reason behind Jesus telling this story? You're right. He's going to put that parable down. He's going to lay that truth down and put that normal activity of the day right there in front of it. But what's the reason he's going to give them for telling this particular parable? It's a forgiveness thing. It's what Peter has been asking. It's what the disciples are kind of afraid to ask. He said, here's really how it shakes down. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven, stop. What's the kingdom of heaven? There you go. Don't miss the fact that we're still studying Matthew, and Matthew will still talk about the Messiah, and that he'll still talk about the kingdom of heaven. And those are going to be keys in his book because he is writing to Jewish people, and that's what they're looking for. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven is like to a king who wanted to settle accounts with his slaves. Okay? How many of you remember when they used to have mills, cotton mills and that type thing around in towns, and they'd have mill villages around and even have a mill store there where the employees could put things on credit, and at the end of the month they'd pay that line of credit off. It's the same idea we have here. This is like a mill village store where these employees are kind of buying something or getting something that they would need to live, and they're doing it off the goodness of this particular master. And at this point he said, we got too many irons in the fire, we're going to have to settle some of these debts. And so that's what he does. Now, this particular copy of the Bible that I have was last published in the year 2000. That's not when it was translated, but it was last published in the year 2000. And when he's going to speak of these two amounts, he's going to put them in dollar forms so that you and I can understand them a little bit better. Please understand that these are not literal dollar forms, but where we can see the contrast in it, okay? So he says, when he began to settle, one slave owed him $10 million and was brought to him. Since he couldn't pay, the Lord ordered him, his wife, his children, all the possessions that he had to be sold, and payment to be made. When you look at verse number 25, let me ask you a question. Remember back when we spoke about Exodus chapter 21? And keep it in mind as we're talking about this slave right here. If the master is selling his wife, his children, and himself to pay off the debt, did that man come in there with a wife? You know how I know that? He ain't selling any more of the slaves. Come in there with kids? Yeah. So everything that he has, everything that would belong to this man and his family, he's selling off in order to pay this debt. And so the slave fell to his knees, this is verse 26, before his Lord begging, "Be patient with me and I'll pay you in full." The Lord, having sympathy, released him and canceled the debt. But that slave went out and found a fellow slave who owed him $20. And he seized him and choked him and demanded, "Pay what you owe." Then the fellow slave fell down begging him, saying, "Be patient with me and I'll pay the debt." But he was unwilling and had him imprisoned until he could pay the debt. Now his fellow slaves, noticing what had occurred, were greatly grieved. And they went and told their Lord everything. The Lord summoned the forgiven slave and said, "Wicked slave, I forgave you all the debt because you begged me. Should you not also had sympathy for your fellow slave as I had for you?" So the Lord, the angry Lord, delivered him to the tormentors until he paid all that he owed. So also my heavenly Father will do with you if you do not forgive each one of his brothers from your heart. I have seen a vehicle that would fall in my mind as a tractor type vehicle right up and down the road here. But it's about as tall as the ceiling. It has a big old open spot on the bottom. What does that thing do? Sprayer. Okay, well, my bad. So from last night, I hope you know, I don't know anything about farming. So yeah. No. It was not a mailbox, so we'd try not to hit it. Sorry. Not really. Reckon how much one of those costs brand new out of the box? To what? 200,000? Maybe higher? If you get all the bells and whistles, you can go to 500,000 or more. So it's not within the realm, out of the realm of possibility for us to buy some equipment and be $10 million in debt, which seems like just a stupid amount of money to me. But in order to do those things efficiently, you got to have those, right? Or a bunch of kids, one or the other, which almost may cost you $10 million anyway. Here's a servant who owes $10 million. I don't know how I would begin to pay that off. I don't even know how that would fit within the budget. But somehow, some way, it looks as if he's making some sort of payment, but the Lord, the master here has said, it's time to settle the accounts. And so he goes to the guy who owes the most money, obviously, right? If Mark owed me $10 million and I needed to get back some money for my business, wouldn't I go to the guy who owes me the most money first? That's how I get the biggest whack at one time, right? So he goes to this guy, and I can see how it happens as he falls down to his knees and he says, "I don't have it, but if you'll give me some time." Which I think of every gangster movie I've ever seen in my life. Give me to next Thursday, when somebody gets their arm broken or their thumbs shut in a trunk or something. But that wasn't the case with this Lord. That wasn't the case with this master. He gave him the time. Not only did he give him the time, he said, forget about the debt. My house did not cost $10 million. Not by a long shot. But if my mortgage company called me next month and said, we're going to forgive the debt, I'm going to say, woohoo! Hooray! I'm going to be real happy over that. Here's a man who owes so much more than he can pay. So much more than he could possibly ever pay. And the Lord forgives him, cancels the debt, verse number 27. But I want you to look before canceling the debt in verse number 27. There's a phrase that is mentioned about the Lord here that is not mentioned about the slave. Read verse 27 out for me, Tate. Chapter 18, 27. That's the phrase. Moved with compassion. Here says, has sympathy toward. The Greeks were a funny people. We say things like in our society that I love you with all my heart. It's everything I have for you. Everything in my heart I would give for you, right? Yeah, we understand that idea. The Greek would look at the human anatomy and say that your gut, your belly, is the furthest down in your body that you can go. And so throughout the King James Version, you'll read a phrase called bowels of compassion. That is, it comes all the way from your guts. You have love for them from all the way up. Almost like you're throwing it up on them. And that's gross sounding, but it's as if you're covering them over, that you're giving them everything that you have. It's the same phrase you have right here. He has compassion all the way as far down as he can have. Read that verse one more time, verse 27.
Then the master of that servant was moved with compassion, released him, and forgave him the debt.
Let me ask you this question. Why? Why did he have compassion toward him? It's not because of who he was. It's not because of how great he was. He seemed to be kind of subpar. Almost seemed to be a beggar. So why would this master look at him and at some point in time, in some level, have some sort of compassion toward him? Tells us a lot about the master. You have two schools of thought on what this master could have done. One is the school of thought what Jesus would say, where this master has compassion on him and lets him go. The other school of thought is this master's trying to make this money back, and he's focused in on that. Somehow, some way, this master cares for this guy. If we compare it with Exodus chapter 21, this guy's only going to be here 6 years. And so he has compassion on him. He has sympathy toward him. He releases him. He cancels the debt. And if the parable ended there, we could draw several conclusions. One of the conclusions we could draw is how much God loves us and cares for us, and how much he sent Jesus the Christ to pay that debt. We absolutely could draw those conclusions, and how we've had that debt paid for us, that there's no possible way we could pay ever in our lives. We could draw those conclusions there from verse number 27 back, 21 through 27. If the parable stopped right there, it'd still be a great parable. It would teach us all about God and His love for us. But the parable's not designed to teach us about God. The next few verses will let us know that the parable is designed to teach us about us. What would you stop? Notice the next few verses. But that slave went out and found a fellow slave who owed him $20. Open your wallet. How many of you can pay his debt right now? How many of you got $20 on you? I can pay a tenth of his debt right now. That's terrible. I'm just surprised I got actual dollar bills. Look, $20 is what, a third of a tank of gas nowadays? Well, a quarter, depending on what you're driving, a quarter tank of gas.
I got $5.
Well, me and you together, we got 7, so we're getting close to half. I can write a check for the rest. I guess that's right. I can write a check for the rest. We could pay that debt right now. That is, because of the place where we live and because of how we've been blessed by God, that's chicken feed. That's nothing. We can just pay it off. But still, this man owes this $20 that he doesn't have the ability to pay off. Well, it's not $10 million. No, it's not. But if you owe $10 million, or if you owe $20 and you don't have it, you still can't pay either one of them off. You're still in debt. You're still kind of scratching and saving, trying to figure out where this money can come from. And so, this slave, this forgiven slave, seized the other man and choked him. Not only grabbing him by the arms, I'm going to grab Albert since he's on the front row. Not just grabbing him like this, but he's grabbing him here. He's grabbing him to choke him and say, "You give me the $20. I wish I had. I'd give him $20 to get him quit choking that fella. It's $20. Do you see the difference in the mindset between the master and the forgiven servant? The master wrote off $10 million. And that forgiven servant can't see past $20 to let his fellow servant go. Now, the original here would indicate that it's all in the same day. That right after this guy hit his knees and said, "Forgive me of this $10 million debt," and he did, that he immediately went out and began to choke this guy. It didn't sink in. He didn't get the message. He goes out looking for that $20. The fellow slave fell down and begged him. Does that sound familiar? He falls down on his knees and begs him, and he says, "Be patient with me and I will pay the debt." Go back to verse number 26. "Be patient with me and I'll pay you in full." They just near about, and I wish I had my other Bible here, I'd tell you if it was the exact same words, but they in the English, they just near about said the exact same thing. And there's two different ways they were treated. I mean, he just nearly said the exact same thing. If you'll give me a chance, I'll pay it off. No, put him in prison. Put him in prison for 20 bucks. Imagine, if you could, having to go down to the jail in Bethany and somebody was able to lock you up for $20. I'm assuming that the paperwork and the time for the officers who were there cost more than 20 bucks. And at one point they just go, get out of here. 20 bucks? Are you kidding me? They'll lock you up for 10 bucks? It's 10 bucks? Here, let me give you 2 for somebody who's missing theirs. We'll get somebody paid. 20 bucks. You put him in jail for this money. Notice this. He was unwilling to forgive him, and he imprisoned him.
I got somebody in prison.
All right. Let's talk about that one after class. So we have a guy here who has been forgiven and now has the opportunity to either forgive or not forgive. He chooses not to. He puts his fellow servant in prison. And his biggest problem in this whole parable is he didn't do it in secret. Look, Eric's looking at me like, what are you talking about? Look at the next verse. It wasn't the family of the man in prison who went to the master. It wasn't his cousins or his brothers or his wife. It was the folks around him, the fellow slaves, noticing what happened. They were disturbed. They were greatly grieved. They saw the injustice. They saw a man be forgiven and then refuse to forgive. And it's not the family of the guy. It's the folks around him. They go to the master and they tell him what's happened, which just makes this master's day. He's just so happy to hear about this guy who he just forgave a gigantic debt. Here's what we read. They went and told their Lord everything. How many of you have more than one child? Have you ever noticed when one of those children gets in trouble that the other one starts piling on? Yeah, did you know about this? Would you hush? They just start unloading everything. And in my mind, I can hear them saying, yeah, and 14 months ago, he beat his dog up too. That ain't got nothing to do with this. And they are unloading everything. They are not holding anything back. They went and told him everything that happened. They told him everything that upset them about that situation, about that person, and about how everything happened. And the Lord then called that forgiven slave and said, I'm going to need to see you. Now, I wonder, at this point, does the forgiven slave here think, well, he's already forgiven me. We're already square with the house. And so maybe he wants to put me in charge of something. Or maybe he wants me to make me the head over this particular task. Or maybe he wants to just check in with me and my family. He knew that was a pretty high cost that he paid. Or maybe he just enjoys my company. Maybe he's going to move me in jobs. I no longer have to work outside. I can work inside, or I can work wherever. I don't know what this particular slave is thinking, but it seems to be, and it would indicate that he doesn't have any idea why he's being called up there. He's just having a big old time. Yeah, he wants to talk to me. Of course he does. That reminds you of anybody? Reminds me exactly of Haman in the book of Esther. He thought he had everything going his way and that the king there was going to give him a parade because of who he was. And there's this guy back in town that Haman really hated called Mordecai. And he said, why don't you give Mordecai that parade? Boy, that took the wind out of Haman's sails pretty quickly. Well, this seems to be the guy. He's just puffed up. He said, I'm ready to go. Here we are. And as that slave comes in, here's what you hear. Wicked slave. You know what he knows now? This ain't going to be good. You ever walked in the house? You probably haven't heard this, but just insert your own name. You ever walk in your house and hear your mama back then say, Billy Hayes? Oh, no. Yeah, those are fighting words. We can't talk about that. She ever call you by your whole name? And it's over then. Did I tell you to? Oh, no. You probably did. And I probably did not. You can tell by the tone. You ever walk into your house and your wife say, Billy Hayes? Oh, my. You can tell by the tone. Something's not right. This is not going to be one of those pleasant conversations of, my sweet, loving bride, where would you like to go? I'd like to take you out tonight. Where would you like to go and get something to eat? That's not one of those conversations. This is, why don't you ever learn how to flush? Put a seat down. What's wrong with you? That one could go for days. What's wrong with you could go for a long time. Did you pay that? Oh, no, I left it on my desk. Please don't make me kill you. That's where that one generally ends. You can tell by the tone that it's not going to be the conversation you want to have. And he says, wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you begged me. True or false? There was no other stipulations on it. There were no strings attached. The master forgave the servant because he'd run out of options. He had no options. What is he going to do? Sort of scrimp by and give him 10 or 15 bucks every now and again? It's $10 million. He's never going to be able to touch it. And so the master says, I've forgiven you that debt because you couldn't deal with it. You couldn't pay it. Should you not have forgiven the other slave for his debt? No, master, here's why. I should not have forgiven him because that's what he owed me. Well, that's what you owed me. Yeah, but I shouldn't have forgiven him because he could have paid it. You could have paid some of it. There was compassion extended here, and there was nothing extended here. Go back to Peter's question in verse 21. Albert, would you read verse 21 for me, please?
Then came Peter to him and said, Lord, how oft shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? Till 7 times?
7 times? Because at 8, no more compassion can be extended. At 8, Eric, I'm not going to forgive you, and there's nothing you can do about it. At 8. Are you kidding me? Can you imagine? Try to imagine the atrocities that God has forgiven me from, and I want to extend that courtesy to someone else. That he has taken off of my plate because of the debt paid by his son. And I'm not going to extend that courtesy to anybody. I'm going to give you 7 times and that's it. 34, the angry Lord delivered this slave to the tormentors until he paid all that he owed. Stop. I want you to answer a question. How do you make money in the world in which you live? How do you make money, Josh?
Well, I go to work to make money.
You go to work. Anybody else make money? Anybody know what money is? I'm not asking if you print it off in the back room somewhere. Do you get paid for a job that you do? Yeah, barely. Barely. What if we put you in prison, you can't do that job? That employer is still going to pay you? No. All right. Apply that here and tell me how this guy's going to pay this debt off. He's going to have to sell ramen noodles and cigarettes or something in prison. There's no way he pays it off.
I like ramen noodles.
Me too. There's no way he pays it off. He is absolutely now stuck. He cannot go any further in paying his debt off. So he's going to be delivered to these tormentors until he has it paid off. Guess what? He's never getting out of there. For this man, in this case, he'll live the rest of his life in this jail and die there because he can't pay this off, because he doesn't have compassion. Do you know how he avoids that? Giving up 20 bucks. That's what we're talking about. Give up the $20. Have a little bit of compassion. Look at somebody else in their particular situation and try to understand them.
Or give $5.
Try to understand where they are and what they're doing and why they're doing those things. In this job, this particular job, you meet a lot of people who want to confide in a preacher. Tell me a story, I don't mind. I'll listen to it and not tell anybody else. 9 times out of the 10, they want me to justify what they tell me. Here, the unmerciful servant wants his reaction to be justified. Let me ask you a question. Did the unmerciful servant have the legal right to do what he did? Yeah, he did. Maybe not the choking part, right? But everything else says put him into prison for 20 bucks. Yeah, he had that right. Didn't the master also have that right? Sure. It all boils down to how I extend compassion from a person who is forgiven to a person who's not yet there. Remember last night we talked about the seed that fell on the road, and that road wasn't ready just yet, but if we took the time to till it and cultivate it, that it could be? That tilling and that cultivation starts right here with compassion. If I can't see a human, whether he's a member of the Lord's church or not, if I can't look over and see a human who's in a bad way, what's wrong with me? I like if I'm in a bad way for somebody to say, look here, man, let me help you out with this. Hooray. Thank you. I appreciate that. At the same time, I'm that guy who's not willing to do the same thing. Let me tell you what I've learned in 4 years in Hot Springs. Are you ready? You help people because it's the right thing to do. I have put siding on the house. I didn't know I could do that until they said, just do it this way. I have several times cut grass at a friend's house because one of two things. One, because I like cutting grass. But two, because it helped them out. And I've had at times others who would say, bring that car you're having problems with up to the shop and let's fix it. I've sent flowers and cards to people without a name on it, and they've done the same for me. Why? This is the right thing to do. It's the compassionate thing to do. It's the difference between